Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in. In our podcast, we review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and we discuss issues related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA CEUs. Visit our website for other courses, including live courses, webinars, blog posts, and SLP Masterclasses available for graduate level credit. SLP Nerdcast is committed to improving continuing education in our field through affordable pricing and open access libraries. You can support our work by leaving a review, referring a friend, making a one-time contribution on our website, or subscribing. You can subscribe for as low as $7 a month and get access to monthly Q&A sessions, exclusive content, discounts, and a resource library of downloads, freebies, and printables. Want unlimited access to ASHA CEU courses? There's an affordable subscription for that too. For more information, visit us on our website or contact us anytime on Facebook, Instagram, or at info@slpnerdcast.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we can't wait to connect with you.
And just a quick disclaimer, the contents of this episode are not meant to replace clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts, and guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures mentioned during our episodes unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and a fair representation of each topic that we tackle. That being said, it's always likely that there's an article that we've missed or another perspective that we haven't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please email us. We love hearing from our listeners.
This episode is brought to you in part by listeners like you and one of our amazing corporate sponsors, MedTravelers. MedTravelers is your industry leader for exclusive allied healthcare travel opportunities. MedTravelers has benefits like higher earning potential, W-2 employee status, and a flexible schedule. Visit medtravelers.com to learn more. MedTravelers did not participate in creating the contents of this episode. We're so excited to welcome back our frequent flyers, Dr. Trina Spencer and Dr. Doug Peterson. Welcome back, guys.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's always good to be with the SLP nerds.
Yep. We love having you guys. Now, Trina and Doug, you guys are here to discuss multi-tiered language instruction and intervention. And for listeners who don't know, we were lucky enough to have Doug and Trina join us several times before. If you haven't checked out our previous episode on MTSS, you definitely should. Today's talk is going to be a little bit more of an intermediate level talk, and it's geared towards speech-language pathologists in schools who probably have some familiarity with MTSS. If you're listening, you feel like maybe you need some more background, we would definitely encourage you to check out our previous podcast with Drs. Peterson and Spencer. Now, Doug and Trina, for our listeners who haven't listened to our previous episodes with you, could you please give us a little bit of information about yourselves?
Sure. I'll start, I guess. I'm Trina Spencer. I'm an associate professor at the University of South Florida. I'm in the Department of Child and Family Studies and an affiliate faculty in Communication Sciences and Disorders. I do research primarily on multi-tiered systems of support with assessment and intervention combos, right? But all in this tiered framework because I believe all kids need support in oral language, not just those with disabilities. But it's a great way to differentiate it. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Go ahead, Doug.
It's great. Yeah, I'm Doug Peterson. I'm at Brigham Young University in the Department of Communication Disorders there. I'm a professor of speech-language pathology, and my research is very focused on learning potential, both assessing learning potential and the interventions required to get at someone's learning potential to both measure it and improve someone's learning over time. So it fits nicely with the dynamic assessment and with MTSS that we're going to talk about today. And I think that's enough about me.
Well, we're so excited to have you. I know that you're both really passionate about this topic, and you've been involved in this field for a long time. Before we get started, I do need to read our learning objectives and financial and non-financial disclosures. Sometimes people write in, they ask me to skip this. I can't. ASHA makes me read it, so I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible. Learning objective number 1, describe the characteristics of effective language instruction. Learning objective number 2, explain how academic language can be addressed through narrative intervention. And learning objective number 3, explain how response to intervention within multi-tiered system of supports reduces the number of evaluations SLPs will need to do. Disclosures. Dr. Peterson and Dr. Spencer's Financial Relationships. They are co-authors of the Story Champs curriculum and Pearl Dynamic Assessment. They receive royalties from the sales of those items. Dr. Spencer and Dr. Peterson are the creators of the Cubed Assessment. Kate, that's me. I'm the owner and founder of Granbois Therapy and Consulting, LLC, and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures, I'm a member of ASHA SIG 12 and serve on the AAC Advisory Group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, Mass ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group.
Amy, that's me. Financial disclosures. I'm an employee of a public school system and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures are that I am a member of ASHA SIG 12 and I serve on the AAC Advisory Group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. All right. Now the good stuff. Trina and Doug, why don't you start us off by giving us just a quick refresher overview of MTSS?
Okay. Doug, I'll let you have this one.
Okay.
Softball. He needs a softball right now.
She's so kind to me. A quick refresher of MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, or a multi-tiered system of support. So this is a larger umbrella of a concept where it's all about a process of having multiple tiers or intensities of intervention that you apply to individuals according to their need, and you monitor their progress over time to determine whether they need more or less of that intensity, of that support. Now that's a very gross, very simplified, concept of MTSS, but it applies to lots of different areas, reading and math and behavior. So that's why it falls under this umbrella of multi-tiered systems of support. And it is pretty well established conceptually in the area of reading and behavior, particularly in the area of decoding and in behavior. So that's a very quick and ugly overview of MTSS.
If you would like
I didn't even have to say that it was ugly.
a more beautiful and longer overview can be found in our previous episodes with Doug and Trina.
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at our learning objectives. Should we just dive right in? The first one?
Yeah, I think that's a good plan.
All right, let's do it. Talk to us about the characteristics of effective language instruction. What are those features?
Okay, well, there's a lot to that, so it's not that simple. But one of the things I think that's good to talk about right now is that MTSS is a system to organize differentiated instruction, right? And Doug mentioned that the MTSS, model is pretty well established for decoding and for, behavior. There are other domains in which their schools are still struggling to establish well. And one of them is comprehension. Okay. And if we're talking about comprehension, we're really talking about oral language skills. So first, we have to understand that there's a constellation of oral language skills that are needed to be able to understand what one hears and what one reads. All right. And those skills are this. You have to understand discourse structures. So a lot of people call them text structures, but I like to call them discourse structures because the structures are pretty much the same, whether it's expressed through oral language or written language, right? So I like talking about them that. They are things like patterns of stories and, main idea, key details, compare and contrast, those kinds of things. Those are discourse structures, like the way the entire discourse is structured. There's also vocabulary. There's complex sentences. There's inferencing. Okay. I feel like I'm missing one. What am I missing? No, words. It's words, sentences, and discourse. And inferencing is kind of all the stuff in between. Okay. So those are the language skills that need to be addressed to ensure that kids are reading or understanding what they read, right? And most of the schools are pretty good about doing RTI, or response to intervention, which is a construct within multi-tiered system of supports for decoding and, even somewhat for behavior, but not for comprehension. And that's one of the reasons, at least Doug and I are very sure, I guess is the right word. We're very confident that that's one of the reasons why we have so many students in this country failing to read on grade level in the 3rd and 4th grade, is because schools are not attending to these oral language constructs, like this constellation of oral academic language skills. So we need to have good differentiated instruction on these things. And MTSS is simply an organization for that. But within that, I don't know, Doug, do you want to say something before I transition to like our 10 principles or anything like that?
Well,
And principles, that was a
going to
cliffhanger.
I would just add that schools, individuals in the schools are well aware of the need to improve comprehension, and they know that that's like a very important aspect, of course, of reading. That's the purpose for reading, is to comprehend. And I think that there's also really an attempt to try to improve language, but it tends to be a very passive approach where children are listening to this kind of language that they are going to be reading, but they're not necessarily producing it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. That sort of segues into these principles of narrative intervention, where it's not just sitting back and being a passive person who's just hearing a story or something like that, but there's active engagement. Well, but I don't want to jump ahead. I'm just saying that's sort of like, I'm just trying to explain what's happening in the schools right now. It's not that maybe they're not trying to focus on this, but they're maybe not doing it in the way that is perfectly aligned with the research evidence.
Yes, and actually, Doug, I obviously I agree with you on that, but schools that do a good job with oral language, let me take that. Let me start that over. All right. There are many schools using oral language and oral language instruction or to support instruction, but oftentimes it's in spirit of decoding. So they're using oral language strategies to figure out decoding or word recognition. And in fact, oral language is what we need for comprehension. We need oral language for decoding too, but they're not necessarily oral language strategies. We have to learn the code itself, right? Phonological awareness, letter sound correspondence, blending, segmenting, orthographic mapping. We need those things, right? But we don't want children to rely on their understanding of words and vocabulary and guessing to be able to figure out what that word says. So that's one of the things that happens in schools today, not in all of them, but in a large number of schools today, they are using language to try to recognize words. And what they should be doing is using language to improve comprehension. And that requires some more explicitness of oral language instruction to build those constellation of oral language skills that I mentioned before, that I needed. Yeah, I need those too, clearly. I'm not speaking in complete sentences. So, or it's not that oral language is totally neglected, but somehow it's misapplied, right? Okay, so then, Doug, do you feel good about me making a segue, or do you want a segue?
No, go right ahead.
Okay, well then. So I didn't mention, my background training is a lot in instructional design. And it's one of the reasons why Doug and I have made such good partnership, is that we have really complementary skills. And so I did an internship on instructional design many years ago, and 20 years ago. It's 20 years ago. And so I have really enjoyed that. And as a result, we've been able to develop different kinds of interventions and instruction based on a set of principles. And in 2020, Doug and I wrote a paper called Principles to Practice, Narrative Intervention Principles to Practice. And we included 10 principles. We actually have more than that, but they wouldn't fit in the manuscript. So we had to slim it down to 10. And these 10 principles really, they use narrative intervention as the focus, but the principles generally apply to all types of language interventions and really all types of instruction, because the principles of instructional design apply generally, right? It's just in this particular paper, we focus on narrative intervention and review the research on narrative interventions. And one of the nice things about narratives in general is it's very, very easy to differentiate with them. Those are things that kids need at tier 1, which is the whole class. Like every kid in the classroom actually needs to be able to retell a story or to generate their own story. And in fact, there's so much storytelling that happens in the regular day, yet kids never get explicitly taught how to tell stories, how to organize stories, how to use, subordinate clauses and temporal ties. They don't really get any explicit training on that, yet it's pervasive in schools. And then we also use narratives as a jumping off point to get to other complex structures like information, right? If you don't have a really good foundation in narratives, which is easier, simpler, pervasive in our lives, it's sense making to us. If we don't have that foundation, it's a lot harder to understand the structures in like science and social studies texts, right? And there's a whole, movement around information and knowledge, but the truth is the children don't have the organization capacity to learn that content because they haven't mastered narratives yet. So we use narratives as a jumping off point to get to that where we can teach these other types of things. So that's one thing. I don't know. I feel like I'm still rambling. I haven't really gotten to the 10 principles yet.
I'm following right along. Your ramblings are extremely coherent and intelligent. Continue.
You're painting the picture as to why we're using narratives as an anchor to talk about these principles.
I follow. I just hope there's a quiz.
You're exactly right. We use narratives to kind of anchor these principles because it's also easier for clinicians to use when they can anchor it in something. They can learn these principles through a medium that is familiar, that everyone likes. It's motivating. Stories are super easy and motivating because every kid's got a story to tell. Every clinician has a story to tell, right? And so we can teach really complex, high-level academic language like that constellation I mentioned in storytelling, and kids don't even know they're doing instruction or therapy. They don't even know because it's so much fun, right? That's actually principle 10, make it fun.
Is this a countdown? Do we start with 10 and get to 1 at the end?
All these cliffhangers.
I do want to add that narrative intervention is part of this concept of contextualized language intervention. That's one of the main reasons why you would focus on narratives, is because you are actually doing intervention in a meaningful communicative context, right? So you aren't just fractionalizing it and piecing out individual parts of language. Instead, like, you're not just looking at vocabulary or sentences, you are looking at discourse, which is putting everything together. And that right there is so much construct validity to that. It's like the real thing. You are working with individuals doing the real thing of communicating with narrative, which is what we do, like Trina mentioned, all the time. So that's sort of like the really big picture, like why you would even focus on discourse in the first place, because it is actually language, which is what's used for communication.
So that's actually principle 1. I'll get us started there, okay? Now that we hit number 10, let's do number 1. It's really teach the context so you can use that context as a context for other language intervention. So we describe it as building story structure, or that discourse, before vocabulary and complex language, right? So once you have established storytelling repertoire, right, you've taught kids how to tell stories, and they can give it character setting, problem, feeling, action, ending, consequence, resolution, and feeling, right? Once they can give you that, then you can start adding into it vocabulary, complex sentences, inferencing, right? So it's much easier to teach these really high level, higher order oral language skills once you have built the context. And that's why it's such a magical, it's contextualized language intervention, but it's in a context that kids already enjoy doing, and it's very relevant to them, and useful for all academic subjects, of course.
And yes, it's something that they come in contact with naturally throughout throughout their day in every environment. I mean, I think that's such a good point.
Mm-hmm.
That's
So
my 2 cents.
Yeah. So in our research, we attend to building the stories, right? Teaching kids to engage in oral storytelling, whether that's retelling, generation, personal generation, fictional generation. We teach that so that we can build the other complex language features more easily. And it certainly happens quite naturally and rapidly. But if you were to jump straight into like trying to teach subordinate clauses, kids would be like, what the freak are you talking about? Right? It's isolated and not integrated into this complex language, right?
Well, it stands to reason that it's also like a bit less meaningful too, because even if you say, oh, we're working on this because it's important, it feels a little bit separated out from actual application.
Yeah, exactly.
And we do tend to first focus on personal stories, which really have a lot of meaning to individuals. So when you ask a child to tell about a story about a time when they got hurt or they got lost or something like that, they are interested in themselves. They're interested in their own story. And so you don't, and we'll get to this too later. I'm sorry, I keep jumping ahead, I feel, but you're not reliant on extraneous reinforcers or anything like that. This is very much something that they're interested in themselves, and they want to participate because they simply want to talk about what's happened to them. It's interesting to them. Mm-hmm. One other thing. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to move on to principle 2. But you go.
I just want to highlight in this one, principle 1, that there's 2 ways to look at it. One is to actually teach narratives, right? So that is narrative intervention, where you're teaching children to tell stories. And then the other concept is narrative-based language intervention, where you're using narrative as that medium, or as that base in which you place everything else into it, and everything else fits into it because it's language. So anything related to language fits. And so that's essentially what we're talking about in principle 1, right? You're building first that story grammar, and you're really teaching narratives. That's what you're teaching. And then thereafter, you're adding in vocabulary and complex language that you see across discourse genres or in any kind of language application.
Yep. Well said, my man. There's your little happy dance. Is that your success? Yeah, you did good. Pat on the head, Doug.
For those of you who can't see, Doug is doing a shimmy of joy at the praise he's received.
Oh my gosh, this is so hilarious. Okay.
Moving on to principle 2.
I'm going to go to principle 2. The principle 2 is to use multiple exemplars to promote metalinguistics and generalization. Here's what we mean by that. Actually, I'm going to give you an example of what it's not. Here's what's common.
Wait.
What?
Wait, no. I've got the example of what it's not. Hold on. When I first started doing narrative intervention, all I did was one story. I drew and wrote one story. And then I kept increasing the complexity of that story. And I was like, oh man, look at the growth that my students are making. This is amazing. And I mean, it did, look, I'm not telling you that I carried on with this forever, because I did realize that, I needed to show that they could actually tell stories, other kinds of stories better as well. But I literally started out with just one story and did the opposite of multiple exemplars.
Was it a riveting story?
What's that?
Was it a riveting story?
Ooh, it was about a frog that kept eating different animals, and it would act like the animals that it ate. It was a weird story, man. I'm telling you.
I kind of like that story.
The frog got so fat. He ate like a cow, and then he ate a horse. He got so huge, he didn't know what to do. He got stuck, and so then he ate a bird and he flew away. It was ridiculous.
Look at that. That's a good story.
Okay, but notice he has that story memorized. Okay. And I'm going to say that is not the goal of contextualized language intervention or narrative intervention or intervention in an MTSS model. That is not the goal. The goal is a generalized repertoire, okay, of language, generative language. And you cannot accomplish that if you're teaching memorization or a single story. So here's what's common in schools is we use book reading. Now, there's nothing wrong with book reading, right? I love storybook reading, love it, love it, love it. However, it is not great to increase the intensity for a language that's needed, right? Because we need kids to be generating language and not just listening to the language, okay? Especially if they are at risk or have disabilities, they need to be generating language, which is actually principle number 3, promote active participation, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But in number 2, what happens when you do book reading is the books are long and more complex than what we would expect children to produce in terms of language. And as a result, you repeat the same book on multiple consecutive sessions. That's standard. That's kind of like anybody who's learned about using storybooks in language intervention, they read the same book for 3 times in a row. That promotes learning of those words and understanding that story, but it does not promote a generative language. Like what we use is we create our own stories and we have illustrations that go with those stories, and the stories are used to explicitly teach children to retell them and to then generate their own story that's related, right? So we get to personal stories rather quickly. And those stories are not repeated in consecutive sessions. Now they can be used in cycles, like maybe 12 sessions later, right? But the idea is to build language that you use for storytelling, not used for this story, okay?
That was a good differentiation. Sorry about your frog story, buddy, but I think it's toast based on Trina's schooling just then.
But it could be one of the stories.
Doug has officially gone from happy shimmy to sadness.
No, let me back up with this, by the way. Doug needs some credit here because he taught me what narrative intervention was, right? Like I didn't have a concept of this. But here's where our duo works really well. The first narrative intervention study we did together, I looked at his teaching procedures and I said, hey, Doug, I know we're not that good of friends, but do you mind if I change this? Right? And he said, yes. And that's such a good guy. He was willing to improve it, right? And say, hey, let's do this better kind of thing. And that's exactly what happened. And as a result of some of the tweaks in the instructional design piece, we actually created something that is freaking awesome. And I'm sorry, that's so unprofessional to say that, but it's true. Our intervention works so well. It is powerful because it has all these instructional design principles embedded in them. And we've got a ton of research to suggest that it works better than just reading stories to kids. And you can delete all that stuff if you want.
I was going to say the reason that I think it's justified for you to say that it's freaking awesome is because you have evidence to back it up. That's not your opinion. I mean, that's the research.
And we continue to improve it, right? It's not always perfect, right? That's the point of being able to do research, is that we find the holes, we find the areas of weakness and make them better. That's why we want to be researchers.
So before we go on to the next principle, can you give us a quick recap and just read the list? So I know you mentioned 10 and we're going to get to 10, but starting at number 1, just as a quick refresher in a linear fashion, bringing our listeners back to where we are.
Sure, I can do that. So 1, building story structure and then adding on to it. Vocabulary, complex language. 2, using multiple exemplars, which Trina just went over. 3, promoting active participation. 4, contextualize, unpack, and then reconstruct stories. So whole, part, whole, essentially. And then using visuals, that's number 5, using visuals to make abstract concepts concrete. Number 6, deliver immediate corrective feedback. 7, use efficient and effective prompts. 8, differentiate, individualize, and extend. Number 9, arrange for generalization opportunities. And 10, make it fun and engaging.
I love number 10. I want to get to number 10. So we've gone through the first 3. And what was are we ready to go into number 4?
Yeah, we can do number 4. And number 3, there is a slight, I just want to punctuate this one point, is that children are not going to gain an oral language repertoire quickly if they're not also producing language, right? If somebody was reading to them from birth and they had all this exposure during their early years, it might work, but it's not rapid enough for the kids that we're talking about. So they have to do, during narrative intervention, the kids are talking. And we call it the talking game, right? And so they have to produce the language, not just listen to it. Okay, so modeling, retelling, that's a lot of what our intervention looks like. And that's what number 3 is about. Number 4 is contextualize, unpack, and reconstruct the stories. What we mean by that is to not pull pieces out and teach them in isolation. That's tempting. People want to teach what a character is. You know what? That's not meaningful to kids. Keep it in a story where it's meaningful. The parts of a story are only meaningful, juxtapose the other parts of the story. It's the relations between the events that are important for comprehension, not the events themselves. And when we pull them apart in isolation, train them like drilling, whatever, it reduces and completely fractures it and reduces the meaning of it. And the meaningfulness of it is what's going to help children remember and stay engaged and be able to retain the skills that they're learning. So
sorry.
Yep, no, go ahead.
Can you give us a little bit of an example of what that process might look like? Because I think that a lot of people are pretty familiar with trying to do exactly what you said and saying, all right, I'm going to read you a story, or you're going to read a story, and we're going to underline the character, and we're going to circle the kickoff event, and we're going to identify all of these different components. How can our listeners also make that more contextualized and embedded within a story? How does that conversation look different?
Doug, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so well, really the way that we do it is we are always working on these individual parts, whatever the difficulty or whatever aspect of language the child is having difficulty with, or that we're trying to teach. We are teaching that always within the framework of narrative or of discourse. So they know why they are learning about how to include the internal response or the emotion. So they are knowing, they're understanding this because they're trying to communicate with us in a story. The communication is still happening, and there's communication breakdown. And so they're going through and they're telling their story, and they tell us that they fell, I don't know, fell off a slide or something like that. And we can be confused about that. Like, why did you fall off the slide? Notice how that's just like a very meaningful, natural question. But now here, what we've done is we've honed in on a very specific language target. That person now needs to talk about causality. And that usually requires the use of a subordinate clause, a causal adverbial subordinate clause. So it's not in isolation, though. It's not like, oh, today we're going to learn how to use, left branching adverbial subordinate clauses that focus on causality. No, it's like we're communicating with narrative. And guess what? I don't understand what you're telling me right now because you're not giving me the causal information. So let's focus on that.
Well, and one thing that I thought of as you were talking was just the contrast between those two examples, where in the one that I gave, they're reading a narrative that's been provided or hearing a narrative that's been provided. And in your example, they're generating a narrative and just kind of getting back to that back and forth component where it's not just about listening. It's not just about taking it in. And when you're actively producing it, there's all these opportunities to be a lot more meaningful. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and you can see the active participation part is missing so much in our school system, because when students are finally required to produce academic language, it's usually either in a book report or in written form, usually in writing. And their writing is, well, generally not very good. And that extends all the way into college, right? And I mean, I love my students, but they have a lot to learn about writing, as we all had a lot to learn about writing. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. And that's an active participation factor.
So I'm just going to give you some procedures that we use in our program. It's called Story Champs. And there's very explicit teaching procedures. However, the explicitness is more on like the larger steps, and we don't isolate explicit instruction on what a setting is. And that's what we mean, is like, we don't just sit and have a conversation about setting. We just help children produce the setting in the context of a storytelling. So I would model a story, and we prepare our own stories to make sure all the complex linguistic targets and vocabulary are in the stories. So we have lots of stories that we use for practice. And I would model the story, right? And I would be laying down some visuals, some icons that represent those parts of the stories. I would put them down at the same time as I'm telling that part of the story, without saying, this is a character is the person the story is about. Like, none of that, right? We don't need any of that. Kids never need any of that when it comes to these kinds of targets. And then afterwards, then I might have them label them really quick. So that's the unpacking. So the first one is the modeling, the contextualizing it. Then we would unpack, where they would just label the parts of the story: character, problem, filling, action, ending, something like that. And then we would go through a series of activities where they are maybe we're answering questions like, who was the story about, right? That's putting it in a piece, right? We're just targeting character. But then once the whole story is answered, and who is the story about, where did it take place, what was the character's problem, how did he feel about it, blah, blah, blah. Once we've done the unpacking, then we would put it back together and model that story again as a whole, right? And so that's where our whole construct comes, and it maintains the meaning and those relations between those events, okay? And we would never teach in isolation one of those pieces, right? Because in some other narrative programs, or in other kinds of, literacy instruction, they would be like, well, today we're going to learn about a character, right? But that's not meaningful, right? It's meaningful when it's within the practicing of it. And so in Story Champs, we teach those structures through retelling, because it gets kids talking, right? Which is our active participation. And then quickly we say, okay, now has something like that ever happened to you? Like, when was the last time, you got hurt? Guess what? Every kid's been hurt before, because we have a story about a kid, scraping his knee, right? Our stories are about realistic experiences that children have, so that they are like, hey, that happened to me once. I went to the doctor and had to get a shot. Well, guess what? Every kid does. If you've been in kindergarten, you got to get your shots, right? So those are the experiences we write about, so that kids will want to engage, and they do, right? Then they're talking about themselves, they're generating, and already it's whole. Right. But then what Doug was talking about is, like, if they miss something, we would go, wait just a second, I'm confused. Who's this story about again? You didn't tell me who the character was. Right. And then we get them to do it in sequence, like character, setting, problem, filling, action, ending, that kind of thing, in a flow that puts it all together in a meaningful way. Okay. Yes.
This approach seems so holistic that I'm reflecting on my own previous intervention, and I'm cringing, because I have totally done, this is a character, unnatural, not related to discourse. I'm sure I have to assume that there are listeners out there who are having the same experience as you're explaining this, because this approach seems so deeply rooted in context that there is there are many facets to learning. I mean, it's just, good job, guys. Keep going.
A lot of this show is just Kate and I reflecting on how we've done things poorly in the past.
Really, it's just me, let's be honest. And you're like, I read 6 articles about this, and I'm like, oh, I'm a dummy.
Hey, one of the things that is a little ironic, and Doug says it all the time, he's like, the behavior analyst just talked about generative language and contextualizing stuff. Most of the time behavior analysts are getting accused for, like, working on things in isolation and these discrete skills, right? The thing of it is the science doesn't tell us to do that, right? The science is a lot more complex than that type of instruction. And there is a science about these, and it's called manipulative autoclitic frames, if you want to get technical, right? It's the same idea as these metalinguistics. It's the same idea. So if we put all that we know about behavior analysis and instructional design and language development that I had to learn from my buddy Doug, right? If we put those all together, we actually get superior instruction and intervention. And kids learn this rapidly. And if they're talking about themselves and learn how to talk in an organized manner, guess what they do? They talk to their friends at lunch. They tell their moms about what happened at school that day. They tell their teachers. One of my favorite stories recently, I did a training for some SLPs in the whole state of Florida. And it was on a Saturday. Monday, this SLP tried out this Story Champs intervention with one kid who they couldn't get to talk the whole year. Hardly said 2 or 3 words. After one session, he went back, I think he was a first grader. He went back into the gen ed teacher and he was so excited that he told this gen ed teacher his story his personal story that he generated in this one session. Whole story, beginning to end. And the SLP just watched, and the gen ed teacher's eyes were just like huge, like, oh my gosh, I've never heard that kid say that much the entire school year. And this was one session.
That's
One
awesome.
session.
That's a pretty exciting story.
Yeah. So we only know the ones when they email me, right? They email me and she's like, oh my gosh, Trina, can you believe it? You know, I'm like, yeah, I can believe it. I've seen it happen. So.
Notice that when this child went back to the classroom to the teacher and was telling the story, they didn't have pictures in front of them or icons to help them tell that story, right? And the 5th principle is using visuals to make abstract things become more concrete, which is really important. But you'll notice that in our narrative intervention approach, we fade those visuals in every single session. And that's really important to recognize, right? Because we are always trying to get to the real thing, to language, the way that language is used most of the time in someone's functional world. And it's not like you have like a flip chart of pictures or something that, you know, work your way through your story of how you got hurt at recess. So we fade those in every session, we fade them. But those visuals are certainly there, and they're very helpful at first. But you'll notice that the children will fade them themselves also. They rely less and less on visuals the better that they get at telling stories.
So you've been taking us through each one of these principles. Principles, isn't that what they're called? Principles? We're at number 5, 6?
5.
We're at number 5.
So we should talk about number 6, delivering immediate corrective feedback, which we've already really touched on, right? And the way that this immediate corrective feedback happens is very naturally. At least that's the way it's supposed to happen. Like in the real world, when someone is telling you about how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or when someone's telling you about a time when they got lost, it is totally normal and okay and acceptable for the listener to stop someone and tell them that they're confused or they don't understand, or to ask questions, right? To elaborate, to get more information from that person who's telling the story or who's giving the information. And that's what that deliver immediate corrective feedback is all about. We interrupt the children all the time when they're telling stories or when they're going through expository text or whatever it might be. And we don't do it in an unnatural way. It really is just like, I think Trina modeled this earlier, it really is like, so an example would be like if a child is telling a story and they start out by telling you that they are sad, or that's not unusual, right? You know, I was really sad, I was crying, whatever. It's not unusual for you to stop them immediate corrective feedback and say, why were you sad? And we ask this open-ended question, which that leads us to number 7. Trina, you should take it away. Add to 6 if you want, and then roll into 7.
So like our corrective feedback and our prompts, they're kind of like the same kind of thing. They kind of work together. We want to use the prompts quickly so that the flow of the story doesn't get interrupted, right? But that they are actually telling the parts of the story in a proper sequence and that they're causally related and temporally related. But we have kind of some standard prompting procedures. The first one is a 2-step prompt. We first ask an open-ended question, but like specific, not just, hey, what happened, right? We're actually asking a question like, well, that sounds like a feeling. Sorry, that sounds like a feeling. Why do you feel that? Now you've jinxed me, Doug.
It's not me.
That is so funny.
I'll
Okay.
tell the story.
Okay.
I'm
So
gonna be the little kid. I'll tell the story. Oh, I was really sad. Yeah,
wait,
I was.
wait
Yeah,
just a
something like
second,
that
Doug.
happened to me. I was sad.
Wait, Doug, why were you sad?
Oh, because I fell off the slide and I hit my head.
Ah, I see. You fell off the slide and hit your head, and that's why you were sad. Okay. All right.
Mhm.
So that might be a
Bravo.
very natural prompt, right?
Thank you.
But if the child had a hard time answering the question, like if they didn't quite know it, we don't sit there and drop hints and, go through a hierarchy of prompts. We simply tell them, right, what the answer is, if it's a retell, right? If it's a generation, that's a little harder, in that particular example, he was talking about his own personal story that I may not know. But if it's a retell, it's very easy. I could say, oh yeah, John crashed on his bike. Now you say that.
Oh, John crashed on his bike.
Excellent. Thank you. That's right. John crashed on his bike, right? That I'm modeling it for him. So the 2 steps are, first, ask an open-ended question, right? That's specific to the part that they missed, and then follow it up with a model if necessary. And that kind of takes care of all the prompting necessary for story grammar, or the parts of the story, the discourse structure, right? But we would also do models if we were targeting specific linguistic targets or vocabulary. So let's say we wanted the child to use the word because, but they didn't. They just said, I got hurt, I was sad, right? And I'd say, oh, wait just a second. Let's say it like this. Listen, I felt sad because I got hurt. Now you say it that way. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
Like that's
and
all
what
we
is
would
it?
do, is just simply model it. And we could base that model on the child's language. I don't need to say, hey, use a bigger sentence. I don't need to use anything else, just modeling it for them and let them repeat it. And so our,
And what
our
look,
prompts need to be efficient and effective. Sorry, Doug.
sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say that what is overlooked all the time is having the student actually produce that language. So it's not just like, why were you sad? And then the child says, because I got hurt. You have them put it together. Say, I was sad because I got hurt on the slide. You say that. And so it's the whole thing put together. And then we often have them go back one step in the story and then continue with their story, because this is a meaningful communication context, right? So one day I was at the park and I fell off the slide and I got really hurt, and I was sad because I got hurt, and just keep going until there's a breakdown, until they leave something out. And then you do this immediate corrective feedback again.
So what Doug just described is what we call an overcorrection procedure, and it is extremely powerful. So if you've got kids with really significant disabilities and you do that type of correction, you correct the immediate element they are, and then ask them to go back one element of the story, right? And then keep going. Oh my goodness. Like it just hastens their language skills so quickly. They rarely make those mistakes again, because the overcorrection kind of takes care of it. It's really powerful. And they're fast, right? We don't have to spend too much time on this.
Right. You're forcing them to talk in that dialect, in that academic language dialect. Yeah. So the next principle is differentiate, individualize, and extend. And that very much applies to the third objective, which is about MTSS, like how narrative intervention applies in MTSS, right? Because it totally is amenable to differentiated instruction and individualized instruction, because some students might be working on story grammar, others might need to focus on causality or temporal terms or whatever it might be, or some need tier 2 vocabulary focus. And you can do that, all of that, through this narrative or discourse expository focus.
Yeah, all in the same session, what he's talking about. You could have like 4 kids in the same intervention session, and they each have different targets based on their assessment data. In addition to that, you could be delivering narrative intervention at a whole class, like a teacher can deliver it, right, to the whole class. And in that context, you're not going to be able to get as individualized, but you can work on storytelling, right, as the structure, story structures. And then you can also do small groups, and you can go to one-on-one if needed. And the smaller size of a group that you go, the more individualized you can make it. And the more intense you make it, because you increase the opportunities for children to respond.
And even in our large group master lesson plans, they're semi-scripted, which can really be helpful to teachers and others who haven't done narrative intervention before, right? So, but in these large group settings, there's still individualization that happens. We have the students pair up, we do peer tutoring, and we have the students are still, even in that large group setting, they are still producing the expository language or the narrative discourse, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. And then in number 8, differentiate, individualize, and extend. This is a really important one because it is a mistake to stay too long teaching story grammar and staying too long on narratives and staying too long on oral retelling. We've got to move to things like personal generation, fictional generation. We got to move to things like informational retells, right? And domain specific vocabulary words, which can be taught there's lessons for those things. And we also need to move from oral to written language. So we have multiple studies, I think 3 that are published or just about to be published. No, 3. We have 3 published studies that show our oral narrative language improves writing. Okay, so without teaching writing, we can get effects on writing. That being said, we also have lesson plans to teach writing more explicitly so that we actually practice it orally and then, practice it in a written format. And one of the things I constantly say when I'm doing training is children cannot write what they cannot say, right? So writing in absence of oral language development is just spinning your wheels. And that is so important. We've seen it over and over and over again that we can improve writing without ever teaching writing directly. But making that transfer more explicit or intentional for children with language learning disabilities is going to be more helpful.
Right, and that's principle number 9, right? Generalizing, arrange for generalization opportunities. And arrange is the right word for that, because you're already building an oral language foundation. And so anytime you go to apply anything language related, there's going to be that background, that support for that generalization to happen. Right. So it's sort of cool. Often people will post on Facebook or something like, how am I supposed to improve the writing of my first graders? I don't know how to do writing instruction. And I just usually want to do this quick little jab, like, improve their language. If you improve their oral language, then they'll write the way they talk. And if you improve the way they talk, that will improve the way they write. I haven't done that yet because I feel like it might sound, I don't know, rude. I don't want to be rude, but I'm just saying, like, you want to work on writing. Oh, what you're really saying is you want to work on language. You just want it in written form.
So remember that constellation of oral language skills. I said discourse structures, vocabulary, complex sentences, inferencing. Those are all needed for oral and written language, for reading comprehension and writing. It's the same constellation in the middle of all these. And so they actually transfer, and there's some theories behind why they transfer across these modalities. But oral is easier. Here's some other kind of principles that are also in the paper. They're more like what's easier, what's harder. Oral is generally easier than writing, right? Because you don't have the transcription, you don't have to write like the mechanics of handwriting, and you need phonological awareness or phonemic awareness actually to be able to write. Retelling is generally easier than generations. Personal stories are generally easier than fictional stories. And talking about or telling stories when there's some sort of visuals in place is easier when there's no visuals in place. So those are kind of like ground rules for like how you progress and extend and generalize. We also, in our programs, we have a lot of family engagement activities. So the kids go home with things so that they're telling stories to their parents. And we even have some research that involves that, especially we have some under review right now with our Spanish speaking kiddos. If they work with their parent at home in Spanish, it builds their Spanish vocabulary. it's kind of like an add-on to the classroom instruction that they're getting in English. So that's kind of fun. Those are lots of ways to generalize though.
That's awesome. So I'm just sort of zooming back out again, thinking about, we know that principle number 10 is have fun or make it fun, or I'm probably botching that, but general idea. And we started the episode talking about a general introduction to MTSS. And now we've gone through this very comprehensive, context-based, robust intervention related to language and narratives. And our third learning objective is related to MTSS and speech evaluations. So I'm wondering if you could tie this all up in a little bow for us and sort of connect the dots between how all of these things are related. Because I know every SLP out there saw that their third learning objective and was like, how can I get less evaluations?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. Doug, do you want to start? I'm definitely going to talk about the research. At least
okay,
once.
yeah. So I'll just talk about the concept here. So the really wonderful thing about MTSS is that everyone is engaged in helping the students. And so in an MTSS world, you have the classroom teacher who is doing oral language instruction with all of the students. And when you look at reading outcomes in the country, and you look at reading comprehension of our students, you can see that the majority of our students in the country need to improve their oral language. And so, so this is something that the teachers can do. The SLP obviously can't take this on all by themselves, right? And so the teacher is helping, and paraprofessionals are helping improve this oral language. And so here's what happens. Let's say you have an English language learner who is in that classroom. Well, they are getting this evidence-based explicit language instruction from the teacher, and maybe they're even going to tier 2 instruction, not because they have a disorder, but just because they need additional instruction in this dialect of academic language. And you are monitoring their progress over time. If that English language learner is a typical language learner, they're going to make progress just like everyone else. And so they will not be referred for special education. They will not be referred for special services. So it is this giant dynamic assessment filter that's happening. And so then what happens is teachers will come to you in an MTSS context and say, this student's been receiving tier 1 and tier 2 evidence-based language instruction and intervention, and their progress is still not adequate. Now that is a student who very, very likely has a language disorder, right? Because you're eliminating this whole teaching issue. They're actually getting the instruction that they need, and they're still not learning adequately. Okay, so there's the concept. That's how it really potentially can reduce the referrals to the speech language pathologist.
Mm-hmm. So if tier 2, which is really supplemental for all those who are at risk, is delivered by, let's say, paraprofessionals or a literacy specialist, that kind of thing, what's going to happen is those kids, many of them are not going to get referred to the SLP. So it'll reduce their evaluation, the numbers of evaluations, right? Now, we generally recommend that the school-based SLPs be involved in that. They might provide training, consultation, oversight to those tier 2 interventions, but they don't have to be the primary interventionists. And in fact, that's kind of the way we've been doing the research. Sometimes the SLP does deliver those interventions depending on, what happens, the dynamics of a school building. I'm going to talk about 2 studies really quickly. One was with preschoolers, and it's a published study, we published it in School Psych Review. And we did an increasing intensity design research study, which really means the kids all started in tier 1. Those kids who didn't progress in tier 1 got moved to tier 2. And after several weeks at tier 2, only the children who didn't progress moved to tier 3. So it was a multiple baseline design study with 7 preschoolers, all of whom spoke Spanish as their primary language, and all of whom were about to be recommended for a speech and language evaluation. So we are like, hey, why don't we just use these kids and let's run them through this RTI process, or this, MTSS process. And we did this, they got intervention. Only one of those 7 kids did not progress in tier 2 instruction. And he moved to tier 3, and he was the only one that ended up getting a SLP evaluation. And he was the only one that was found to have a language impairment, right? So right there, we saved the SLPs in this district, 6 kids. 6 out of 7 of them were actually just fine and progressed well with tier 2 instruction. Okay. That's published in School Psych Review, and we'll make sure it's linked to the study or to the website. The second study I want to tell you about is a little bit larger study. We worked with 2 districts in Michigan across 10 schools, and we randomly assigned schools to be part of the MTSS treatment. We used a Story Champs intervention at 1st grade. The gen ed teachers delivered tier 1 instruction, and then the SLPs or a paraprofessional, a literacy specialist, provided tier 2 instruction. Here's what I want to tell you. There were 150 kids in these 10 schools that came up at risk of needing intervention. Guess how many of those actually had identified language disabilities? 150, only 13 kids. The rest of them were children who were at risk and had language difficulties that were impacting their academics, but nobody had picked them up because nobody was screening for them, right? So in these schools that were assigned to the treatment group, they arranged tier 2 language instruction, and those kids never really needed to progress to the language eval or to a reading disability evaluation, but they would have had they not been picked up in a tier 2 oral academic language intervention, right? And we saw some great effects. It was really an implementation study, so the effect of the intervention was not the primary case, but the arrangement of how the SLPs kind of assisted in the school's MTSS, that was the focus of the research. And again, none of the SLPs provided all of that intervention. They kind of consulted, guided, served as a team member on the MTSS leadership team.
So, I mean, that's incredibly important data that is sort of like world changing, job changing. That's really powerful. That's the word I was looking for. That's very powerful data. And I'm wondering if in our last minute, you could, I don't know, give some actionable steps for any SLP out there who is listening to this, who wants to start implementing MTSS in there. Like, that's powerful data right there. That's job changing. What do you do?
The first thing I would do is download the Cubed. It's free. Just get practice with that. And then you'll get some data on kids, right? And maybe find a friend, like a kindergarten teacher or 1st grade teacher, that'll let you screen her classroom, like all the kids in her classroom. And you'll see the distribution of the language needs in that classroom. Just do it for kicks and giggles, right? Just at first, because oftentimes the other educators in the building will not recognize the need for language. They'll be focused on decoding. So you can't just walk in and say, hey, we need to add oral language to MTSS, because a lot of them are not going to be convinced. But the way to convince them is to screen some of their kids and, show them data that says, yeah, this kid should probably get a tier 2 comprehension or oral language intervention, right? And then the teachers are generally bought in and said, yeah, I want my kids to get what they need.
And one other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking about the research, Trina, I can't wrap the episode without saying it, but it's very impactful for the SLPs for sure, because our caseloads are lower, but also it's super impactful for all of these kids who didn't actually have a learning disability and just needed additional instruction. So this is, this is certainly a workload issue, and we know that that's a huge thing, and we talk about it all the time on this show, but it's also an equity issue. It's an access issue. So I think that there are a number of ways that conversation could be had depending upon the priorities of your district. But that's cool stuff. Very cool research.
And as usual, I could talk to you guys about this for another million years, but we have to wrap up because we're out of time. For anybody who is listening who would like to take this one step further, we will link all of the research that was mentioned in the show notes. We will link the cubed assessment. We will link the Story Champs. We will put a link to Story Champs so that if you are listening and you would like to take some actionable steps, there are resources available for you in the show notes. Doug and Trina, thank you as always so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us. We hope everybody learned something today.
Thanks for letting us talk about this stuff. It was fun.
Yeah,
thank you guys.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon. Another big thank you to our corporate sponsors, Med Travelers, who helped make this episode possible. Our corporate sponsors keep our CEU prices low and our program ad-free. Med Travelers is your industry leader for exclusive allied healthcare travel opportunities. Med Travelers has benefits like higher earning potential, W-2 employee status, and a flexible schedule. Visit medtravelers.com to learn more. Med Travelers did not participate in creating the contents of this episode.